Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. Welcome everyone to Abraham Education. I'm Michael Abraham. This is my YouTube channel. I'm very happy today to have a very special guest, our sister and Sheikha Fatima Baraktulla. Assalamu alaikum, sister.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So we're going to be talking, inshallah, about a lot of things pertaining to raising Muslim children, perhaps inshallah with a little bit of a focus on females in the modern times, and also taking into account this new context that is emerging for our Muslim community and considerations for raising our children with all the mechanisms that caused the war on terror context from before. Inshallah, we're going to dig all into that. So just to briefly introduce Sheikha Fatima for people who don't know, Fatima Baraktulla is an Islamic scholar. She is an author and broadcaster based in a leafy area of London in the United Kingdom. She is a mother of four, one who is an adult and two teenage sons, two of whom have memorized the entire Quran, and also a school-aged daughter. She empowers parents with practical advice and transformational insights from the Quran, Sunnah, and teachings of the scholars to help them confidently raise God-centered families so that they can fulfill their duty as caretakers and shepherds of the next generation of believers. In 2017, she began developing a course called Raising Believers to help Muslim parents achieve more confidence and gain the tools and practical Islamic guidance regarding raising Muslim children properly. She has also authored this book, Khadija, the story of Islam's first lady. And talking about books, myself as a public school educator and someone who teaches parents, also Muslim parents, and teaches teachers in the public education system, and I'm also just a language arts teacher, books and reading are a very big thing for me. So I want to just highlight this book a little more extendedly because it's actually a very, very important type of book that we really need a lot more of as a resource for our Muslim community. Because this is a book about Khadija, one of the mothers of the believers, and it is based on sound, authentic knowledge, but it is also written in a prose that is very digestible for someone who has been raised and conditioned to reading English language narratives. You know, for myself, I have three daughters, 13, 11, and 9. They are all very good English language readers. My wife came to Islam a little more recently. So for her, teaching them about Islam is something that she's very insecure about, doesn't have all the tools to do herself. I, of course, am burdened with time doing that. So I was extremely pleased to be able to get a book like this for my girls who are very, very good readers, and for them to be able to learn in a way that correlates with the way they have been conditioned to read. And even, you know, many of our brothers who are students of knowledge out there, you know, this is a type of project that needs more undertaking. Just writing books that target, you know, that this book, an advanced reader at age 7 or 8 could read this book, but really it's suitable up to ages 14, 15, I would say. And you know, targeting that age group, that late childhood, early pubescent age group, we need more books that are written like this, specifically for an audience that has learned how to read in English really well, that is based on sound, authentic knowledge. This is a project that I'm very grateful to you, sister, for having taken on. And I believe you are writing one on Aisha now, too. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, I am, alhamdulillah. So just, it's almost complete, inshallah. But yeah, the whole idea behind these books was to write books about the great, you know, people of the past, our Sahaba and role models of the past, but write it in the style of literature, you know, so a child who reads Harry Potter, or sorry, I don't want to promote any particular book, I know that's a controversial one, Roald Dahl, or, you know, any kind of authors that children are reading nowadays or have been reading. they should. There's an enjoyment, isn't there, in that literature, because it's written in a very creative way. It's written as with great storytelling, and I think that was really missing from our Islamic books. And I think I really realized that growing up, because I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and in London here, and my dad would, desperately look for books wherever he could find them. Any book in English for children that he could find, he would just buy it and bring it for us. And I remember a book about Fatima radiallahu anha. And of course, because my name was Fatima, I felt a certain connection and affinity. But I remember when I read that book, I felt very depressed as a child, having read that book.
Really?
Because not because Fatima radiallahu anha was not an inspiring person. Of course she was, but it was the way the story was told. It was probably a translation, first of all, and it was told in such a dry prose. There was no, like, the author wasn't thinking about the emotional journey of the reader, you see, and wasn't kind of thinking psychologically about, okay, where am I taking the reader? What is the reader going to be left with at the end of this? So it was kind of quite a sad story, the way it was put out. And when it ended, it didn't help you reconcile or understand or, make sense of some of the kind of trials and the difficult sides of the lives of women like Fatima radiallahu anha. So I think with this book, with Khadija, and now with Aisha, I'm trying to be very careful, and I have tried to be very careful that, the emotional journey of the reader is very important. The reader cannot be left with, Khadija passed away and then there's this, it's like a tragic end or something. No, they have to be left with inspiration. They have to be able to contextualize where that little period of life, that little period of history fits into the bigger narrative of Islam, right? And when you put it into context like that, then it becomes like an epic story, because you think, wow, I wouldn't be here today as a Muslim if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hadn't, used those great people of the past, empowered them and given them that opportunity to spread Islam, fund Islam, as Khadija did. Yeah. So that's why it was important, I think.
Yeah, I mean, for any author, you has to consider the background knowledge and experience of the reader that they're targeting. So, I mean, I've certainly seen the exact same thing, where books that were written in the Eastern world, and they're just, and perhaps in a different time period, where they're just flatly translated, again, it doesn't exactly ring home to exactly what you're talking about. So this is something that we need to be urgent about developing as a Western Muslim community. And, there's many like kind of market niche, there's this whole movement actually in the West to have more diverse texts with more representation, as they call it. So, there's many books that have actually developed over the past 10 years, I would say, that attempt to fit the market niche of trying to represent Muslims more. But is it authentic to a actual experience of a Muslim living in the West or elsewhere? Is it authentic to what, as Muslim parents, we actually want to have cast upon our children and their Muslim identity? More often than not, it misses the mark in that, I would say. So they're very, very important books. Now, the consideration for the emotional journey, as you're saying, that's actually something I really, really want to key in on. Because, when I ask people to come on, it's usually for two reasons. One, I just want to know about their own experience growing up, especially for religious people who grew up in the West. How did that end up happening? Because that's essentially the goal that, all the Muslim parents want, and everyone is struggling with, or that they have fear about.
Yep.
And then, secondly, I mean, as I said, times are changing a little bit, but, everyone knows there's been this kind of focus within our community and on social media of sort of a Muslim backlash against liberalism or left-wing politics and this type of thing. So I get asked a fair amount from my followers to talk about how you keep sisters away from liberal type thinking, and me, I'm curious about that as well, raising 3 daughters. And, too, the way I see it with a background in being around children all the time and teaching young people, the emotional experience is a very big part of it, because when a certain type of thinking is what prevails in the society, and being a strong God-fearing Muslim goes against that, that means that living that out is a constant emotional trial.
Yeah.
And kind of constantly pressuring or pushing people to work against that, maybe that can only make it worse, or you have to be realistic about what you are actually expecting from people, as far as I see it, in a main degree. And what can we do to make it easier for people? So I'm just curious about your own journey and how your parents managed to raise you and surviving that, and how you've managed to raise children and surviving it with all the different challenges that Muslims face.
Okay, so I think so. As I mentioned, I grew up in the 80s and 90s in London, and at that time, I would say in the 80s there were not really very many visible Muslims. When I say that, I mean like there were Muslims, but they didn't necessarily wear hijab, for example, observe the hijab or any. There were no markers that would, especially in the UK, the majority Muslim community is Asian. Asian, when we say Asian, we mean Indian and Pakistani, and so you wouldn't really be able to tell the difference between a Hindu or a Muslim, for example, right? Probably we could, but like the average person couldn't, right? And so Islam was not very visible in London. In fact, my mom was the only woman I knew who wore the hijab in our neighborhood, although other women started to wear it after interacting with our family, So my dad is a scholar from India, from Deoband, and he was invited to come to the UK by some Islamic organization, an Islamic organization, for da'wah purposes, to study as well, and then to contribute to the building of the organization and establishing the Muslim community in the UK in the late 70s. He was invited. So we were a religious family in that sense. Mm-hmm. But so I think with my parents, I just saw them as role models. They were always the role model in the community. We didn't grow up in a very rich area of London. We were in probably one of the poorest areas, actually, in what are called council flats, which are like government-built housing, right? Quite rough. Obviously, I didn't know that at the time. As when you're a child growing up, you don't know if you're, in a state of poverty, really, unless somebody brings that up to you. And the way my parents always brought us up was to be very grateful, to feel very rich, to feel very, for me, like I had my mom and dad. I had everything. I had, my dad was generous. He was, my mom was always cooking good food. I mean, that's really all that. We had guests coming in and out all the time, so for us, it didn't matter if we were like 4 kids in one bedroom, especially in the in my early childhood. The way my parents were, I just felt very positive. So I think probably that's where it starts, like having a very positive self-image of yourself and your family,
It sounds like it was a loving family as well.
Yeah, I mean, like my dad wasn't, like the typical Asian men. Like they're not like hugging types, right? Like not particularly kissy huggy types. They're not like expressing their love with words and like that. Yeah. But in actions, 100%. Of course, when we were little, he used to hug us a lot, and he was always, even now, like if my dad goes somewhere, he sees a book that he thinks I would like, he'd always buy it. He's always looking out for things. So they show their love in I would say in a deeper way, than just mere words. but yeah, so we're going to school. I think that's when you realize that you're a Muslim and you're different, you know. But there was a lot of ignorance amongst even Muslims. So a lot of Muslims were very cultural. They would say strange things. They would, but I would go home and ask my dad. He would always say, no, that's not true. You know, tell them my dad is a sheikh, and tell them this answer, right? I think he was just trying to empower us to be able to speak with knowledge, you know. Yeah. And so I think I just thought of our family as, and my mum was always teaching Quran, so children in the neighborhood would come to our house, and she would teach them how to read the Quran. So I think that was, you know, the beginning period. We did face racism.
What was kind of the MO of like Muslims, like your peers who were from Muslim families outside your family during the 80s and 90s? And you know what you're saying about people not necessarily knowing that that the South Asians were Muslim in that context. The same thing actually did happen here in America as well. I write about it a little bit in my own book, Engaging Muslim Students in Public Schools, where I go over the history of how Muslim communities formed in America, because, you know, maybe actually in the UK, it was not as much professional class immigration, because I do think there was some lower class South Asians, perhaps like your own family, who came to the UK versus here. But certainly amongst South Asians who came to America in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the better part of Arabs, although there were refugee Arabs who came too, you know, many of them were coming for professional reasons. They had like English language education back home. And I think even a degree of preparation to Westernize a little bit, or at least to put up a Western presentation, how they presented themselves. So women kind of came knowing they wouldn't wear the hijab, and men knew they weren't going to grow the beard or wear a thobe or that type of thing. So I'm curious, like, you know, we think about, I mean, a lot of the younger brothers, I think, out there too, or just younger people, they think of maybe Muslims in the West becoming more liberal or being more liberal as maybe a now thing. But the peers who you were around who were Muslim, like, what was their general disposition in the 80s and 90s?
Okay, so I think a lot of people from Asia, from South Asia, came. They were middle class people, you know. It's not like they were educated. My dad was educated. He had a job. You know, they were professionals. My dad's brothers are all doctors and, you know, stuff like that. Him and his other brother became scholars. They wanted to be Islamic scholars. So they're from those backgrounds. My husband's family as well. You know, back home they were middle class or upper middle class. But when they came to the UK, so this is quite typical of, you know, the UK experience, especially for South Asians, and probably for the people from the Caribbean as well, obviously. But those were non-Muslims. That they would come here and actually be starting from scratch, you know. So being in a council flat, for example, was not representative of what their educational level or anything like that. It's kind of like where they started out, where most South Asians would start out, you know, in quite financially in a poor state. But the one thing that the South Asian community had is being hardworking, really valuing education, right? Like, it didn't matter if you went to a private school or I didn't know private schools existed, you know. You just were trying to be the best. You're striving, and you saw education, like the idea of dropping out of education was not even a thing. It's not even something you thought you could do. So, you know, university was the minimum, you know, graduating from university. So I think that kind of hardworking ethic really helps the South Asian community. And that's why now you see Muslims, especially from a South Asian background, are in all different areas of life in the UK. You know, your doctor will probably be a Muslim. The mayor of London is a Muslim, right? We've literally got Muslims in every area of life. And I think a lot of them did start off in a situation of poverty. But I think it depends really. Like there were people who came to the UK who had decided, and remember, South Asians came from a post-colonial mindset, right?
Yep.
Recently they had just been under British rule. So there were those who I would say were still mentally colonized. You know, they did see England and Britain as like superior. They see, you know, it's just a psychological thing. They even felt this kind of warmth towards the Queen, and you know, they have this kind of a type of patriotism, a weird type of patriotism, and an inferiority complex. So I think there were those types of people as well, because remember the British in India, they left a lot of schools. There's actually a lot of like convent schools, I think they're called, like schools run by Christians. And even today, I think a lot of Muslims who think they want to get ahead, they won't send their children to Muslim schools in India, for example. They will send their children to very Western type schools. And they saw that as the way to get ahead. And of course, those schools are not talking about religion, they're not talking about Islam or anything. English is the main medium of study. So people who came from that kind of background, you can see that they were very kind of, they would come to the UK, adopt Western lifestyles, and kind of see religions backward, right? But there were also a lot of people who came who were either just ignorant of their religion or they were actually quite religious. And so I think those people, they were not kind of so overtly affected by kind of this idea that the West is superior and having some kind of inferiority complex. They saw that, you know, their role as Muslims was to teach about Islam, to establish mosques in the UK. And I think that generation is very successful in doing that. They built a lot of infrastructure. We have a lot of mosques, a lot of imams, mashallah, a lot of kind of basic institutions. So Darul Ulooms, for example, you know, that was like the model from India of building the next generation of scholars. So I think there were some individuals who laid that groundwork. But on a day-to-day basis, like I said, my mom was the only one I knew who was observing hijab. Other women in our area, they were kind of they just didn't know about it. There was a huge amount of ignorance. I don't know what the cause of that ignorance is, you know. But I think with our generation, what happened was that we then became very curious about who are we, you know. We had to ask that question. Who are we? What is our identity? Because we were constantly kind of asked. We were put on the spot.
In school and things, you mean?
Yeah, definitely. Like, so in my school, I think my school was in a quite a left-wing area of London, right? And so they were very embracing of culture. So we have this idea in Britain of multiculturalism, that you know you can have a society. So it's like the opposite of France, right? Like France does not believe in multiculturalism, but Britain pretty much embraced multiculturalism. You can have people of different cultures. We can celebrate culture, and I must say, even the white teachers in my school, they were always very supportive. You know, they were the sort of people who were protesting for Nelson Mandela. You know, there were these types of people. So I think we had I personally had a very good experience of school. But then later on, we moved.
At that time, did liberal social values come along with it? Because we have the same thing in America, definitely in the northern states that lean Democrat towards the American Democratic Party, equal to the Labor Party there. And you know, the same thing at the same time, more or less. You know now. Well, actually, even in the 90s, I would say, like, it also came along with fostering a lot of loose liberal social practices in the kids and sending the message that type of thing is okay. And actually, statistics show in America that the worst time for adolescent misbehavior pertaining to things like drug use and poor choices with sexual health and this type of thing was actually at its peak in the 1990s. So,
Oh
so
yeah.
I'm curious if that all came along with the schooling context of the UK at that time too, and how it affected the Muslims.
So by the 90s, we had moved to a very wealthy area of London, which was conservative, right? In fact, Margaret Thatcher was the was the MP for the area that I was in. I actually met her as well as a child. Um, but that area, the only difference that I noticed in terms of values was people were a bit wealthier, and there were fewer people of ethnic minorities, you know. So I felt more out of place in that area, and people were not used to Muslims. They weren't used to visible Muslims anyway. And I'd started wearing the hijab from about the age of 10. I wanted to. My mom never even really pushed me to. I think I just wanted to be like her. And I think from a young age, I would notice the social ills in our community, not in the Muslim community, I mean, in the wider society. So, for example, our next door neighbor, she was this single mother, a white lady, single mother, 2 kids. Her husband was like in and out of jail. And you'd as you're growing up, you'd hear about this, and alcohol was involved, and domestic violence, and she would sometimes stand there and just chat to my mom. I don't think my mom really understood most of what she was telling her, but as kids, we understood, right? Because obviously English was our first language. And I would just be quite, shocked at what life was like for the average English person in some of these areas. And I think that gave me a mindset of what I call Muslim privilege. We talk about white privilege, and we kind of people make out that white privilege is like ubiquitous, it's everywhere. It's like it gives people an edge over everyone else, and all of that kind of thing. I actually think a child that's brought up with Islam and who's awake and aware of what's the differences between people and the ills in society and how Islam remedies those, has a type of Muslim privilege, because you grow up with the mindset that my way of life and the way of life of my parents has the solutions. We are like the dawat, like society is full of illnesses, and we've been given the solutions. So, and of course you have Allah in your life, so you grow up with that feeling of having a safety net. So I think all of those kind of values that my mom would inculcate into us, impart to us through stories, through teaching us about the different Islamic mindset to have, in different situations, gave us a sort of Muslim privilege. And I like to encourage parents to think of their kids like that, not let them grow up with a victim mentality, but to actually give them that feeling that you're a Muslim, you got Allah with you.
Now, I have a question about that. And you said your family was at least poorer when you were younger, because I tell parents the same thing here, and the community leaders. And where I am in Minnesota, overall, we have a low socioeconomic status Muslim community, because it's majority people who had refugee experience from East Africa, though there's many others. And you can tell kids that, but oftentimes it seems like they're overwhelmed by matters of the inferiority complex, because it's like, well, you can say that, but at the end of the day, I'm living with my family in some small apartment, sharing a bedroom with 3 of my siblings, while the people you're telling me I have the solution for the people who live in the big house, and they have the lawn, they have 3 cars, all that type of stuff. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, sometimes I feel like kids, they have a hard time buying into that when they're lower socioeconomic status in general.
I don't know. I think children value what their parents value, So if as parents you're constantly going on about money and finances and making that the most important value, the most important consideration, obviously they're going to pick that up, right? But if you're the sort of family who's grateful, who imparts gratitude, so I really think it's about your attitude as well as parents. Whatever it is that you're valuing and chasing, your kids are gonna feel that and start chasing that. So I think a lot of the time it's parents who give children an inferiority complex.
Absolutely. And something I try to explain to parents too is you can exhibit behavior in a certain way that demonstrates something to the kid that the kid will then at its core exhibit the same thing but render it in their own way based on being a child. So for example, if as a parent you do obsess over the dunya too much by always wanting to get the bigger house and feeling like you need to do that, maybe to the extent that you entertain going into haram to get that bigger house, a child will see that and they will get the message that material things are important. And even mom and dad, they play with the idea of breaking the rules to get material things. So as kids, we can break the rules in our own way to fulfill the same ambitions. So it might not look like wanting to get a bigger house, but maybe we want to dabble into something illegal to get the gold chains or the new shoes or whatever, this type of thing. So a lot of times that type of child behavior, it might look very different to the parents, but they're really manifesting the same thing that the parents showed them.
Yeah, so if whatever you value, your children will value, I think. So if you keep pointing out to them everything they don't have, and make them feel that they're, of course, sometimes a person can feel that in and of themselves. They might observe things and feel that, but then when they talk to you about it as a parent, how are you helping them manage those feelings? How are you helping them see those? I think that's what I mean. Like that's where the parents come in, right? How do I view this period of difficulty, or being the odd one out at school? How should I navigate this? I think when a child should have the sort of relationship with their parent, they could talk to their parent about that, and their parent give them good advice, and help them navigate whatever questions and issues that come into their mind.
I'm curious, what would your parents and your father tell you specifically about how to conduct yourself in school and how to navigate the school context? Because, to me, when you raise kids in the West, you send them to school as a Muslim, you're in competition for their mind with what's being taught at school in a lot of different ways. And it's something that they're going to benefit the most from being coached through that. For immigrant parents, it seems to me that can be very, very difficult because they didn't go through the same schooling system. And children, it can often resonate with immigrant parents that like, well, mom, dad, you don't really get it. You don't know what this place is all about, that type of thing. So I'm just curious if you can recall specifically how your parents would talk to you about school and what to think about how to conduct yourself there.
So I think before school, I think there's something at home that's going on that lays the groundwork, right? So I think my mom, for example, she taught us many of the stories from the Quran, and so she would tell us stories, and through stories she imparted a lot of values, I think, right from the beginning. Like I remember one story she always used to tell us, which was in Urdu, in our language, our mother tongue, and it was about it basically imparted the value that no one can hurt you if Allah is protecting you, and little subtle things like that were imparted to us through stories. So I don't think we can underestimate the power of stories in building a child's character and their mindset. Then coupled with that, I think so at school, my dad, he didn't really put much pressure on us, to be honest. He really was very hands-off in terms of turning a blind eye to certain things. Okay. And people would probably consider him quite liberal, actually, the way he he kind of allowed us to find our own way. Okay, there was very little pressure, and that probably meant.
Sorry to interject a little bit. Did he understand adolescence? Did he have like a perspective on adolescence? That's because psychologists will tell you like adolescents need room to explore, and they need room to explore identity and this type of thing. And people can agree or disagree with that. But I'm curious if your dad had that type of understanding.
I think they also inculcated haya. I think that was important as well. Haya, the sense of shame, or sense of, I wouldn't like to call it shame. What's the better word for it? Like modesty, that inner sense that we have, the different adab in the house, in terms of like knocking on the door, asking for permission. I know those things sound really little, but those are the things that lay the groundwork for a girl, for example, and boys having a sense of haya, so that then when you're at school, people are changing, they're having physical education and they're all changing in front of each other. Your fitra is there. You see, your fitra is preserved. So I think my parents put more effort into helping us preserve our fitra rather than interfering much with school. Okay. I think part of that is also because that generation was not very aware of the dangers at school, the negative influences at school. Okay. In a way, ignorance was bliss for them, and our generation, we're much more aware of what's ideologically being taught at school. I think that's why we are more worried as well. And that's why we are more willing to get involved. So part of it is probably, my father, my parents, having a lot of tawakkul, to be honest. Having a lot of tawakkul, doing the work at home. And like I said, my dad would buy us whatever English books he could, about Islam. He was always available for us to ask. So I remember once at school, some girls were asking me, is it true that Muslim men are allowed to have 4 wives? And I was just a little girl. I didn't know what to say. So I just asked my dad. I went home and asked my dad, and so he would help me to be able to answer these questions. And one thing I think that was quite a life-changing experience for us as children was my dad took us on Omah when I was about 11. I think for me that's really cemented my identity as a Muslim. Going up the mountain, to where the Prophet ﷺ received the first message. Obviously making Umrah, going to Masjid Nabawi as a child, seeing a country, even just being in a country where you're the majority, Muslims are the majority. You're not the weirdos, the odd ones out anymore, right? I think that whole experience was so kind of positive. So do you see, I think they were doing their work and they were kind of quietly confident that we would find our way when it came to navigating the side of life that that wasn't very visible to them.
Yeah. Did they, I'm just curious, did they ever send you back to South Asia?
No, we went there like on holiday, maybe when we were kids, but not at all. No, we hardly ever went to India. But I think
it just asked us to like here. It's a fairly common practice amongst Somalis and East Africans here to send their kids back, sometimes for a year. It's a practice that's actually increasing now with the worries about the public education system, this type of thing here.
Yeah. Look, I think my parents allowed us to make mistakes.
Okay. Say more about that.
So, for example, when I was a teenager, I was really curious. I'd never been to a music concert before. And my friends were all going to a particular music concert. And I was just really curious. They made it sound like it was going to be so amazing and wonderful. And like this almost like essential experience, right? That every young person has to have. And so I think I didn't even really tell my dad. Somehow I booked a ticket. I think we borrowed some money, booked a ticket. And I went with them. And he probably knew, my dad probably knew that we were going. But like I said, he really was not a overbearing and kind of overly policing dad. I'm not saying that that's good or bad, by the way, right? Because
that was going to be my next question, actually.
I don't know. Okay, he did his best in his context and his situation. So I did go to this concert, and I hated it. You know, like I was like a girl wearing hijab in the middle of this massive It was like, at the time, it was the biggest outdoor concert I think in the world, actually. And I was absolutely disgusted by it, because I thought, what is this it? Like, you know, so you basically stand in a field and, you know, like there's people smoking all sorts of stuff around you. And there's like these outdoor toilets and we've paid for this. Like we've paid to have this experience, right? And yeah, and I just remember like being surrounded by this sea of people and feeling really scared. And I said to Allah, Ya Allah, don't let me die here. I don't want to be raised with these people on the Day of Judgment. You know, I don't know why I had that sort of feeling of like the Day of Judgment, because it was a sea of people.
You know, a mass gathering of people.
Yeah, it was a sea of people. And the way I'd imagined the Day of Judgment to be, you know, like you're going to be with your people. I was like, I don't want to be raised with these people. So it just reminded me also of Umrah, you know, because we'd gone on Umrah. It's such a crowded time. And I just thought, wow, these people don't know that experience. Like to them, this is bliss. You know, this is the highest experience for them, right? Because they have no idea. They haven't lived. And I think, as crazy as it sounds, I think sometimes we have to experience something.
Right.
Alhamdulillah, even from not fully getting into it in a very bad way, but just be in it to realize it's evil, you know, with true certainty. Do you see what I mean? Otherwise, things just end up being like the forbidden fruit that you're that look attractive and that you've always been denied. So, and I think, you know, I've talked to other shuyukh about this as well. We have a sheikh here in London, Sheikh Haytham, and he often gives advice to parents. And one of the advices he's always giving is do taghaful to a certain extent. Taghaful means turning a blind eye to certain things. Don't be like this helicopter parent, you know, who knows everything that's going on with their child. Reading their messages on their phones, and you know, in every area of their life, not allowing them to make some mistakes, to just experience some things for themselves. Now, that is a risky approach, I think. Okay, I wouldn't say that that we've adopted that approach with our own children.
So I was going to ask if this is how, because you have a younger daughter now, you have an adult son and 2 teenage sons, right?
Yeah, well, the teenagers are, I mean, Islamically, they're all adults. So, yeah.
And would you let them go to, would you turn a blind eye to them going to a concert? But the thing is, too, the context is very different also, too, because I think, you know, I'm thinking about that. A teenager nowadays, you know, here in Minnesota, they could go to certain concerts and they would see girls in some type of hijab there or something. You know, they might see other Muslims there having a good time. So they might not feel as singular as you felt in that context.
Yeah.
So you know, kind of.
So I think part of it was my mom's dua as well. So there's certain key times in life where I could have gone one way or the other, you know. And I really feel that a thought or an idea or ilham, some kind of like inspiration has come to me in those situations. Because if you think about it, that's not normal. Not every teenager will start thinking about the Day of Judgment in the middle of a concert, you know. Like, I do feel that some of that is from Allah. It comes, of course, it is all from Allah. But what I mean is, I do believe that the du'as of your parents for you are a type of protection, in times and places where parents can't be there, where we as parents can't be there. Our dua can have a huge impact, because we can't control everyone our children meet. We can't control every idea that they come across. So to a certain extent, we all have to let go. We all have to, especially when they're older. If we've laid the groundwork, if we've cemented their relationship with Allah, and I think that's a very important thing as well. My mom, she brought us up making dua, and she would sit with us and make dua aloud in her language, so in our language, and we would understand. And so she taught us how to talk to Allah. And so if you've grown up talking to Allah, when I'm in the middle of that concert, I'm talking to Allah still, saying, Allah, don't let me die with these people. Don't let me be raised with these people, because I'm used to talking to Allah constantly. So I think what I'm trying to say is, you lay the groundwork, but you realize that as they get older, you're going to have to let go. There's going to be situations where you can't be there all the time. You can't act like a spy, almost like constantly there. You've got to have equipped them enough to maybe sometimes, make mistakes, or explore, be curious about certain things, but have the judgment and the ability to then discern. I do think part of that also is your friends, the friends that you're around. Now, growing up, I didn't really have the luxury of having a very strong Muslim circle of friends. Okay, I didn't have that at all. But we would go to Islamic events. Like I said, my dad would take us on Umrah. All of that is helping to cement a person's Islamic identity, I think. And so with my kids, I think we have put more emphasis on helping them have a good circle of friends than us dictating everything to them. Because what you'll find out when your kids have, I guess, reached teenage and older, is there comes a time when your children's friends have more influence on them than anything else. Everyone is going to the pro-Palestine protest.
Right.
They're all going because their friends are going, and they get it. They're in that environment. Everyone is praying, so they're going to pray. They're going on a trip. They're going on an Islamic, some kind of camping trip. It's going to be fine because their friends are good, So I think helping your kids to curate a friendship group of people that they're good, solid people, or they're from good, solid families. I think that's very important when they get older, as they get older. Sorry, I hope I answered the question.
No, you did. You know what I'm curious about, because you have that course, Raising Believers, and something that I take away from what you've said about your parents, like, consistency is very important with kids. It's extremely important, and like so many times, people they want to know like the best thing to say to a kid that's going to convince them of this type of thing. Kids in general, their experience, it's more emotional than it is rational. Like they actually struggle to be rational up until they get older. So you can make a very convincing rational arguments to them about why they should adopt Islam, or why they should have this belief or that type of thing. But, just hearing something like that one time really isn't going to do much for them. And it's more like the emotional experience that they're having in life that dictates it.
And them being immersed in it. Do you see? It's not a lecture that you're telling them. It's life. They're living it. So another example I'll give you is my dad. Every single year, he would... Can you hear me? Sorry.
I can hear you. You're frozen on the local on the local recording, because it's probably still fine. So just continue.
Okay. So I was saying that. So another thing I want to tell you is that my like I said, you're living it. It's not just something someone's lecturing you about. So every single year, my dad would go on i'tikaf. I'tikaf is like, staying in the masjid for 10 days. Now, this was a time when there was nobody doing i'tikaf, right? Like, literally, the mosque is empty. It's only my dad and maybe one other uncle, doing it. And we just thought this was quite a strange thing our dad did, We didn't know anyone else who did it. But every single Ramadan, without fail, we knew dad was going i'tikaf. And then we would visit him in the mosque, and we see like he's got this little bed, like a mattress. He's got his own little space. And the message that gave us, obviously, he's not trying to give us a message. He's just he's being him. He has his own relationship with Allah, right? The message that we're getting, though, as kids is, wow, dad is having his time with Allah, Yeah. Like, that's important. And sometimes we would get phone calls. I remember because we used to have an Islamic helpline in our house because my dad ran an Islamic helpline as a sheikh. People would phone and ask questions. This is a time when it was there was no Islamic TV channels or any kind of. Okay.
Cycle.
We're back.
You're back. You were saying there wasn't any kind of Islamic TV channels was the last thing.
So this was a time when there were no Islamic TV channels and things. So we had an Islamic helpline in our house. And I remember this
like a 1-800 or like a phone number you call.
Yeah, a phone number. And I remember once during Ramadan, someone phoned and they were like, "Where's Mufti Saab, right? Where's Mufti Baraktulla? Where is he?" And we're like, "He's in i'tikaf at the moment, So the person was like, "I mean, you can't just leave everything and go and live in the masjid for 10 days and be incommunicado, right?" That this guy was being quite, rude about it. But I remember thinking, oh, no, you have no idea. That's what I remember thinking. I was older by then, when I'd answered that phone call. Sure. I just thought, you just have no idea. But I think that kind of made me realize that what my dad did was not normal, in the sense that it was a big deal that he would literally leave everything. Like, obviously, he had people managing the important things. But what I mean is that is his time for Allah. And he didn't care what other people thought or, like what dunyawi losses there might be. There were no dunyawi losses anyway. But I think, so I guess what I'm trying to highlight again is if we as parents are living Islam, if that's what our children notice and they, pick up and when they see us prioritizing Salah, they want to, eventually they will prioritize it. When they see that it doesn't matter if we're outside or indoors, Salah time comes, we're praying. We don't make excuses. We go and find a place to make wudu and we pray. That's going to just be part of their personality. They're going to see that that's the norm. So we get to, as parents, set the baseline for our kids. What is the baseline Islam? And then from there, now I think in this period of time, the unique struggle that we have is that we and our children are addicted to these devices, So we're not even meeting them sometimes. We're not sitting with them over dinner, chatting, talking about what happened at school. We've become lazy parents because these phones and these devices are very convenient, cheap babysitters that allow us to be lost in our own world while they're lost in their own world. When in fact, what we're doing is we're raising strangers.
Yes.
And so I really think, brothers and sisters, I'm so glad that, internet only came when I was like, I think a lot older. And even for my kids, we didn't really introduce them to devices until they were a lot older. I don't think there's any reason that a primary school kid, so that's up to the age of 11, or even a secondary age kid, so that's 11 to 16, I can't think of any reason why they need a phone or a device of their own, like a smart one, maybe a simple one, in order for you to be able to call them. Like we used to have telephone boxes in London, now those telephone boxes have gone. Otherwise, I wouldn't even give my children a dumb phone, as they call it, right? But I don't see a real reason for them to have those devices until they're older. And I think the more we can delay it, and the more we can be disciplined ourselves as parents, the better.
And they're really not missing out on anything. Speaking as an educator and teacher, like there's pretty overwhelming research that shows that like kids learn better to read and write on paper with the actual text than they do with the devices. And the impulse control aspect of the devices, even adults can experience it. That's a difficult thing to deal with. It's probably 10 times worse for teenagers. Like it's almost something they can't overcome. So, I mean, here in America, the entire education system is struggling with this because during COVID, the tech companies got everyone to adopt a style where it's all based on devices in Google Classroom now. So meanwhile, actually, the elite private schools in Silicon Valley, where the tech executives all send their kids, are actually device-free schools because they know how bad it is for the kids. So it really is an important thing for parents to tend to and try to advocate in their kids' school with if they have to send their kid to a public school or something, that they don't want them on devices so much. Sister, I'm curious, things I want to ask about. Like sort of a daily routine, and you have to have like some formulaic type things that you teach in your course, and maybe it relates to the dean more with raising believers, like some principal things that you have to do as a parent or you have to have in place in parent. I'm curious about a few of those foundational things. I'm curious about like the daily routine and structure that you have set up as a family, because that type of thing is very important. Like you said about, eating dinner every day is so very important. Things like, my family reading before bedtime and finding other times to read together is a really important learning opportunity. I imagine have had that type of thing in a way where you've taught your kids Quran, and some of them have memorized the Quran, this type of thing. So I'm curious about kind of like what you see as like core to the structure of a daily routine for a good Muslim family that you've implemented in your own family, and also too like how you've dealt with. I mean, we've talked. You have identified the most important thing of the parents being good examples themselves. I think most people are going to think still with kids nowadays, there's a more important aspect to sort of proactively, explicitly address certain issues that they will be exposed to, that you want to have the conversation with them first. So, I'm curious how you've handled those two aspects in your own family, if you wouldn't mind just talking off that.
Yeah, I think obviously routines change as children get into different age groups, right? Like now that they're a lot older, I'm not really responsible for their routine, I have to let go and allow them to have more of a routine. But then, of course, as a family, you can have certain family rituals, if you like, or regular check-ins,
Well, but what was it like when they were younger too?
Yeah, so when they're younger, of course, like, probably for us, we chose Muslim schools for our kids. I think my husband felt very strongly. Initially, I felt very strongly about it. But I kind of, when they were going to secondary school, I didn't really mind. Maybe that was naive of me, but my husband felt very strongly that they go to Muslim schools, both boys and girls. So
sorry to interject, because I'm just curious about this, because I have I'm in the US dealing with the education system here, but I have a big following in the UK. Like, is it easier to have religious schools? I say easier, like, does the government help fund religious schools, I guess is the question I'm getting at, in the UK? Because here we have the First Amendment that kind of prohibits that, though it can be different state to state. But I'm curious about that in the UK.
Okay, so by the way, I don't. When I'm saying sharing that, I'm not saying that everyone has to do that. You know, I'm in fact in my course, Raising Believers, we have a whole section where we talk about the different types of schooling or unschooling, even, and the pros and cons of each. You know, because I do think that each type of schooling has its upsides and its challenges, and that actually not every family is the same. So being very prescriptive about this and saying to people everyone should homeschool or everyone should do X, Y, or Z is unhelpful and it's unrealistic. So I would actually rather parents do the best that they can with the resources and the access that they have to things in their unique situation, right? But go into it with the eyes open as to the pros and cons, the challenges, the things that they're going to have to compensate for. Because in every type of schooling, there's something you're going to have to compensate for, or something that you're going to have to maybe support, you know, that has its deficiencies with. So in Britain, I think famously, Yusuf Islam was one of the pioneers, you know, the singer Cat Stevens, who embraced Islam. He famously set up, I think it was the first Muslim school in London for children. And he did so because his own children were reaching school age, I think, and he really felt strongly about that. So, you know, may Allah reward him for that. And so basically my children went to that school. And that school became the first school in London that was government funded. So faith schools, as they're known, Muslim faith schools were not government funded. They were private schools initially. But there are plenty of kind of Catholic and Christians, you know, Church of England schools. And I think also some Jewish schools that were government funded. So I think he campaigned for a long time for Muslim schools to also have government funding. Okay. To kind of relieve, like, you know, as you can imagine, the financial element, you know, because obviously schooling is free. There's a certain allocation of money for each child from taxes, I guess. So I guess his argument was, what about our schools? You know, our children should have that right as well. So alhamdulillah, he was successful in that campaigning. So yeah, so primary school, not all primary schools, but this particular one was not private. But there were some elements that we had to fund, you know, so some supplementary things they wanted parents to fund. And then secondary schools, I don't know of any that are government funded, Islamic ones, Muslim ones. They're all private, even the one, you know, Yusuf Islam set up. Okay. Interesting. So it was a challenge. It's not like we could afford it, by the way, you know, the secondary schools. But I think we just took the first steps and we made a lot of dua, and we just had faith that inshallah we will find a way to be able to afford it. And also some of these schools, they do give some dispensation. So for example, if you have more than one child in a school, they'll reduce the fees for the second and third, etc. Right? So yeah. Okay. But for us personally, my husband, like you said, he felt strongly enough about the liberal agenda, if you like. That is so kind of insidious, isn't it? And really like subtle sometimes. Yeah. Sometimes not so subtle as well, right?
British culture, white British culture, is fairly passive aggressive. Is that correct?
Can you give me an example? I don't know what you mean.
Well, you know, actually, a lot of times the way, I mean, talking about the liberal agenda in school, which is like you said, it's subtle. You know, it's like what Muslims communities here, what we're experiencing is this really passive aggressive approach. You know, it's kind of like without preemptively informing the parents one school year come to find they want to do, you know, LGBT books throughout elementary school. and this type of thing. And then the Muslim parents say something about it, and it's like, oh, you have a what? You have a problem with that? And this kind of pretension. Like, it should have been predictable that this is going to be a problem. You should.
I think it depends on which area you live in and stuff. In Britain, depends on the school, because we do have a lot of Christian schools, actually, Christian ethos.
Mm-hmm.
And they will be a bit more conservative in that regard. They're not so kind of they're more careful, if you like. But yeah, I think overall, I think every parent has to be aware. And in Britain, I think parents do have the right to know what their children are being taught. Mm-hmm. They can also, I believe, ask for their children to be removed from certain classes. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there might be individuals who are passive aggressive, who have an agenda, and they're like, oh, let's try and educate these Muslim kids, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't think that that's across the board at all, So I don't know. I think a lot of school teachers, they're just trying to teach their subject, and because if they themselves have a liberal mindset, right, obviously that gets inculcated, right? Like, without necessarily them thinking that they're doing any kind of conditioning. It's just part of their own conditioning, right? That it's going to bleed in. To be honest, I don't have that much experience of, like, I don't know what it's like during certain times of the year when certain things are being celebrated, if you like, what it's like at school, because I don't have that personal experience. Mm-hmm. But from the friends that I have whose children go to state schools, as we call them, mm-hmm, they're usually very careful about Halloween, about all the different things, and they'll just have a dialogue with their kids, mm-hmm, about those things before they experience it, right?
Yep. And what approach did you take with that type of thing with your kids growing up? So I mean, if you had a modicum of control over them, limiting devices, sending them to a Muslim school, sometimes people look down on an approach where you just shelter the kid from things. I mean, did you take a sheltered approach, or would you explain? I mean, how would you go about explaining the outside world in that respect?
So
and also media exposure to entertainment. I'm curious about that. And of course, we're at a time where sometimes even the little kids shows aren't necessarily safe anymore in this type of thing.
Yeah. So when it came to TV, we didn't have a TV. Okay. We had. Well, I think it's because most people, once internet came, mm-hmm, we didn't feel like we had to have a TV, right? But we kind of choose programs, that we will watch, rather than feeling that you have to watch everything. It's more selective, and yeah, there's a certain level of turning a blind eye. So there might be a particular interesting cartoon or story, but like I said, you're with your kids, so you can talk to them about it if you have to. But yeah, for us, books were very important. I think encouraging them towards books, and even audiobooks, is probably better than these things. I think my kids learn a lot through audiobooks. But yeah, so your question was about entertainment.
Yeah, and exposure to I mean, overly liberal ideas. Okay, like a liberal person would criticize your parenting. I mean, they always say, like, okay, LGBT people exist. Your kids have to know they exist. This type of thing. I mean, this is like,
so in Muslim schools, they talk to them about it. Also, our children are not that protected. I mean, in the sense that we had clubs, that our kids went to, mm-hmm, that were with everyone, like football clubs, or my daughter gymnastics when she was younger, and then art clubs or whatever. There's other activities that like I said, you might compensate, and help them to explore different areas with, and be in different environments. Mm-hmm. And then I think when they got to college age, which is like 18, they're just not in Muslim colleges, you know.
Yeah.
So that was like their first experience, I guess, being out there. But I think if you bring them up with quite a rich experience of life, you know, my kids have probably been to every museum and every all the different types of experiences they can have living in a rich, a historically rich country and city like London. I think they grew up with a huge, I think they're very confident in their Islamic identity. And one thing I noticed is every school they've been to since, so college and then university, because they're so used to, and because they feel an affinity to good religious Muslim boys, if you like, with my sons, they've always gravitated towards those people anyway, you know.
Sure.
And then of course getting involved in the Islamic society, that just became kind of natural for them to do that. And I think by that age, like I said, their group carries them, right? Their social group carries them more than you. Yeah. By then you want to have done the work, you know, basically. For them to, like, if you don't have if your children don't go to a Muslim school, or they don't have many Muslim role models or friends around them, then what you want to do is you're going to have to curate that yourself, either by sending them to Islamic clubs or you know, activities that you have, scouts, I don't know, the different types of things that you could organize, or just even in your own home. Because I've heard so many, and I do get calls from parents, you know, where, and this is a scary call I had a few years ago, a couple of years ago. A lady, she said, we brought our children up in religious families. In a religious family, my kids have all grown up praying and observing hijab, etc. But my daughter has just told us, you know, that she thinks she's a man. I know that sounds like, how did that happen, right? But I asked her to kind of rewind and tell me, okay, like, how did this?
I'm curious, what age was the daughter at?
So she's in secondary school, which is like, I think she was about 15, 16 by now.
Sure.
So she said it started with her daughter being curious about, like, not feeling comfortable in clothes, okay, women's clothes basically, and always wanting to, when they went shopping, she would gravitate towards the men's clothes, and that was because they were loose, right? And I kind of identified with that, actually, because it's only now that there's like modest fashion and stuff like that, right? Or even abayas and things available. When I was younger, if you went to the average shop, the women's clothes, there was nothing you could buy really, like as a Muslim woman, that you'd even want to wear in front of your dad sometimes, right? Like it was quite hard to find decent clothes if you're somebody who's grown up in a modest family. So she said we didn't think anything of that, you know. She just wanted to wear looser clothes that happened to be men's clothes. And then she said over time she started confiding in me that, you know, she feels strange, she feels different, or she feels attracted to girls, right? Things like that. She started expressing this, and I think the mum was kind of shutting it down, you know. Meanwhile, I think the mum quite correctly recognized that it was actually a group of friends that this girl had at school, who were not only supporting this whole narrative but kind of egging her on and encouraging her to lean into these feelings, lean into this way of thinking, and then also to, you know, come out, if you like, and, you know, have, I don't know what they call it, a gender reveal party or whatever it is, right? By then, the daughter had, but this is, do you see, like, this is why social group is so important,
Okay.
Because I'm thinking, okay, your daughter is now being brought up by this social group.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And there does come a time, as I said, when your children's social group has more of an impact on the way they think than you do. So I do think there was a big mistake that that family made at one point, which was they started noticing their daughter was slacking off the salah, right? And they just didn't make a big deal out of it. And so eventually she stopped praying. Now, one of the things I really emphasize in my course, and I think that, so my course is divided into 6 parts, and each of those parts is a different period of a child's life, starting from pregnancy and, birth, basically, and then toddlerhood, early years, and then tamyiz, what we call the age of tamyiz, which is 7 onwards, right? So tamyiz is like when the age of discernment, when a child can, Islamically, is considered able to know the difference between right and wrong in a basic way. And when you start telling them to kind of cover themselves in front of you, you don't, they must knock on the door and ask for permission before entering, all of those. And when you start teaching them to pray as well, right? The reason why I've divided my course into those 6 periods, and then obviously pre-puberty and puberty onwards, is that a lot of parents, what they do is they kind of sleepwalk through the first period of a child's life on autopilot. And then suddenly, when the child is pubescent or prepubescent or puberty age, when certain things start showing up, they panic, right? And they don't know what they did wrong. They overreact sometimes, or they feel like it's too late. Now, for me, it's like, no, this is a gradual process. This is a gradual process. And like I said, the groundwork has to be there. Allah has to be a gut feeling for them in their lives. A gut relationship that they just cannot do without. And of course, that's in their fitrah anyway.
Right.
But also salah has to be that kind of, has to become something they need. And I think that can only happen if it's introduced in that gradual way, as the Sunnah encourages us to. And when one of the mistakes that parents make is they overemphasize some things that are not that important, and they underemphasize more important things. So with this lady, for example, it wasn't that serious to her that her daughter had stopped praying, but it was serious to her that her daughter was starting to lose gender, right? Like, we don't make the connection.
Did you know about how, this is interesting to analyze actually, did you know about how long it was before? So she was 14, 15 when she came out with this idea that she's a man. Like how long before that was it that she had stopped praying? Was it the same year or a few years before?
I think her prayer was like slacking for a few years, but she had properly stopped, by that year or something.
Those here it's middle school type ages, but ages like 11, 12, they can be very, very tricky for parents.
Yeah.
Because the kids do get older, more self-sufficient at that age. There can be a bit of a temptation to want to just let them be more independent at that age. And it's compounded by the fact that they tend to be very, very moody at those ages also. Because so a lot of times, like when you try to do gets, and again, like this doesn't really go against what you were saying before about turning a blind eye. I'm not really talking about the same thing, because there's a difference between turning a blind eye to some things and then just letting their whole habits go by and change.
Yes.
Things that are really core important.
Picking your battles, basically. That's
yeah, exactly. And all kids, maybe females a little bit more so, they can be very, very moody at those ages. You can tell them to put the dishes away and they'll be like, I am, like just impulsively, they will give kind of these really harsh reactions to orders and all that type of stuff. And as a parent with your own kid, middle school teachers don't serve teachers of kids those age. They pretty much don't survive doing that without training themselves to not take the way the kids behave personally,
Personally, yeah.
especially with the way the kids respond to redirection. You know, and like good teacher training will teach like calming techniques and this type of thing to deal with that type of thing. It's and you want to exercise the same thing as a parent, but it's even harder as a parent because just when your kids react to emotions as a parent, it hits you in your core. So that whole thing can cause parents to want to shy away from confrontation at those ages. So this is a really big challenge for parents to accept, because it sounds like this is what happened with those families, like this family. They know she's at that age.
You see, the thing is, right, there are things that have to be the non-negotiables, right?
Yeah.
So look, with Salah, for example, okay, let's just use the example of Salah, because Salah is so important. Salah is not just a tick box thing, right, that we have to teach our kids. Salah protects them from fahsha and munkar. That's what the Quran says, right? So this is your protection mechanism for your kids that's going to prevent them from sliding into the haram things fully, you know, because they got that 5 times a day communication with Allah. It protects them, it keeps them from completely becoming lost, inshallah, right? Now, in order for them to get there, like I said, one reason why I discourage devices is we need to get our kids out in nature, right? They have to see Allah's creation to love Allah, to even know Allah, because they have to love Allah and know Allah to then, when they come for the salah, you know, they're not just doing some empty action. You know, they've seen the sunset, they've seen the mountains, they've been out in nature, seen Allah's creation. They're in awe. You need awe, right, to have that connection with your fitrah, with tawheed, with Allah, of Allah. Now, once you've done those, you know, once you've laid the groundwork, when it comes to the salah, you're just encouraging them, right? The age of before 7, there's nothing. You know, they can just copy you if they want. There's nothing. Once they reach the age of 7, you start teaching them. You teach them how to make wudu. You teach them the basics of the salah, and then you don't force them. You just say, you know, come and pray. Every time there's a prayer time, you say, come and pray with me. Come and pray. But you don't enforce it. So it's just telling them to do it, but not. So in other words, it's like a reminder every 5 times a day. Now their mind is getting used to the idea. And you say to them, you know, look what Allah gave us. Alhamdulillah. Shouldn't we be thankful? Tell them the story of Musa alayhi salam, you know, of how in the Isra and Mi'raj, how the prayer came down, how it was 50 and then it became 5. All of those things, I think, help the child to value and realize what salah is. Now, once they start practicing, hopefully they'll start doing 1 a day, 2 a day, 3, you know, you can celebrate, you can all of that. 10 years old, now you want to make salah a rule of the house. Yeah. Okay, and now parents, for some reason, they're strict about so many things, but when it comes to salah, they think, oh, you know, I don't want to put them off. I don't want to. Would you accept your child not brushing their teeth? Right. Like, seriously, say your child said to you, you know what, I don't think brushing teeth is that important. I'm not doing it anymore. I'm just not doing it. I'm just going to brush my teeth once a day, or I'm not going to brush my teeth. As a parent, I don't think anyone would accept that. They would literally march their child into that bathroom and brush their teeth for them if they had to, right? They would take them to the dentist. It would be like crazy. It would be alarm bells. The seatbelt in the car. If your child said to you, you know what, I don't want to wear it. I'm not going to wear a seatbelt. Okay. I don't know about in where you are, but here it's the law, right? You have to have a seatbelt. We know the dangers of a child not wearing a seatbelt. You could go through the window, basically, right? The chances of having a very bad accident and then being very badly injured are much higher, right? Or even just if you were to brake, your child could literally fall off the seat, right? And fall crashing onto the floor. So would you accept that? And, you know, if you ask most parents that, they'll say no. They say, no, you wear that seatbelt or we're not going anywhere, right? That's what most parents would say. So why is it when it comes to the salah, we suddenly get all nice about it, like too
Right.
soft about it.
Right.
Instead, we need to change our mindset and think just like we insist our children wear their seatbelt because we know it's going to protect them. Just like we insist that they brush their teeth because their teeth will rot if they don't. The salah is one of those non-negotiables parts of their day that just in the same way you would enforce those other things through reasoning, through making it a rule of the house, whatever it is, that's what you do with the salah once they get to a certain age. Because by then you would have done all the gently, all the kind of mindset work and all of that. Now it's probably just a case of laziness. Like probably the reason why they're slacking off is just pure laziness and testing of boundaries.
Correct, right?
Like, can I get away with not doing this? Like most of us, if it comes to chores, if it comes to anything, we're like that, right? Like, can I get away? And you say no. The one thing that's non-negotiable is the salah. So,
and you're saying, and it's by the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, I believe that 10 is the age to make it non-negotiable, essentially.
Yeah, that's when you discipline them for it, right?
It is actually an amazing wisdom, in the general patterns of defiance in children, because defiance is something you have to study as a teacher and know about. In general, it's held like prior to age 10-9, misbehavior from kids is usually based primarily on lack of impulse control. Willful defiance towards parents and teachers that's really intentional is essentially rare prior to age 9. It's usually like impulse control that is the main issue. Once you get to age 9-10, which is like 4th grade in the United States, I taught 4th grade for 5 years. That's when you will start having some kids, not most, but some kids start to practice willful defiance for the sake of attention from peers. And then kids' capacity for that phenomenon only intensifies over the next 4 or 5 years, basically, kind of peaking around age 13, 14. So it's actually kind of interesting because it really is the right time to start drawing the line where they first start to, when they're in the earliest stages of really being able to have the capacity for willful defiance, but they won't really have the ability to practice it that much. So the Sunnah is actually amazing with its wisdom.
But again, social group is so important again. So when they get to a certain age, now you're not watching their every salah, are you? Like, you don't want to have to do that. They're adults. Once they reach puberty, like 15 or whatever it is, right? For that particular child. And for girls, it can be much younger. Now you just want them, you're just the voice in their ear, right? Who's gonna say, you remember to pray, remember to wake up for Fajr, remember if they're going away, for example, you just want to remind them, but you're not being the person who's enforcing it, right? Anymore. But what happens is if they're with a good group of people and they have a good peer group, that's pretty much taken care of because their peer group cares about salah. So they're going to remind each other, but the reason why I'm emphasizing that is that, look, it's very much connected to some of the things that parents complain about in their children, in terms of they're losing their values, they're losing their morals, they're losing haya, or they're becoming influenced by these different gender ideologies and things like that. Part of it is haya and inculcating haya in them, okay? Because a child who's been inculcated with, okay, you keep your aura covered, even in front of me, even in front of, the wider public, you don't uncover in front of people, you knock on the door, you ask for permission, all of the things that our deen teaches us. A child who's brought up with all of that, it's very difficult for them to start becoming shameless, and having, they will feel very uncomfortable even looking at certain things, right? Oh, and that's another thing, right? Lowering the gaze. That's a practice that we've got to get our kids used to from a young age. Not everything that comes in front of you is for you to look at. Even if it's halal, right? Even things, even belongings of people. And, we don't need to be constantly looking at things and we should lower our gaze from dunya in general, right? But especially if something comes on television and on the screen that's inappropriate, if they're used to averting the gaze, do you see what I mean? Like all of these things together,
Absolutely.
the mindset of the child is going to be such that some of these things are going to be so far away from them,
Yep.
inshallah, that but of course you do want a school environment that supports that.
Yeah.
And if it's not supporting it, I think this is why it's important for parents to get involved, be involved in the school. You can't just put them in a school, whether it's a Muslim school or a non-Muslim school, and just expect the school to raise the child.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, mental habits, they start at a young age, and when they're younger, it's when you have the chance to have more control over how they're conditioned. So, I think the everyday, and the Prophet ﷺ, he said that the most beloved deeds to Allah are those that are small but done consistently. So, it happens in the household and with the things we practice, because again, the experience for kids, it's more emotional and habitual than really it is rational. So all the intellectual arguments we develop, not that they don't have a purpose, against liberalism and against whatever ideology, it's for a certain level of mind and for a certain level of education that really doesn't come till much later.
Yeah, I mean, there might be times where you do have to sit down with a child and they, there's something that an attitude that they're adopting that you want to talk through with them. But you see, you that's the thing. We've got to create that environment where they can do that. So, there are aspects of Islam that they might not understand, or they might have, even if they go to a Muslim school, because it doesn't mean going to a Muslim school you're not part of the society. Whatever society has, Muslim school has it as well, but it's probably maybe to a lesser extent. But it doesn't mean these things are absent, right? So even there, your child might come home and mention something, a certain attitude, and you're constantly having that dialogue, right? Where, why do you think this? Like, why do you think that's wrong? Why do you not like that? And you talk them through it, right? You talk them and you help them to be able to understand. You don't shy away from any topic. They should be able to talk to us. I think at a young age, I was saying to my kids, don't let anyone, don't uncover yourself in front of anyone. Yeah, don't let anyone, it's uncomfortable to talk about those things, right? But unfortunately, we have to kind of help them to know what their own boundaries are with their own bodies, and other people should have boundaries with their bodies as well.
And when it comes to talking with the kids, something I did want to talk about, before we're done, just what's going on now and with Israel-Palestine, may Allah aid our brothers and sisters in Palestine and in Gaza and smite their enemies. Like there are lots of parents wondering about, maybe how to talk to kids about this right now. And I'm just curious your thoughts on how this is going to affect young people now, because, we've had the experience of going through the war on terror at the early part of the century. I'm curious your insights, a little bit of your experience on that. Did it shift things compared to your experience in the 80s and 90s of kind of what it meant to be Muslim or the experience of being Muslim? I think the past 6-7 years, I don't want to say it's been a break from that type of Islamophobia stigmatization. It's not been a break, but it's been a little bit more on the back burner than it was during that time. And now it's like a full force. So we had these challenges, so with the main focus of the challenge being the kids being like, okay, they're too liberal or we're worried about those influences. Now there's this whole all the geopolitical stuff is going to come into it now. And we have to start tending to that. So, this is something that we have to think about. I'm just curious your thoughts on it.
So I think we have to, again, if we've brought them up, and even if we haven't, it's time to tell them the stories from the seerah. It's time to tell them the stories from the prophets' times, Those stories, I don't know about you, but they've helped me to make sense of what's going on. Like if it wasn't for knowing some of the challenges that the Prophet ﷺ faced, right? The type of vitriol and hatred that we're seeing, the double standards, the whitewashing, the dishonesty, just blatant dishonesty. The Quraysh had that. Do you know what I mean? Like the Prophet ﷺ's time, they had media, their own type of media onslaught against him, right? Demonizing him and his people. And then, of course, we know about how weak the Muslims seemed to the people in Mecca, and how they thought they were just going to quash them and crush this rebellion or whatever they saw it as. And we also know there were people who knew that they were wrong and that the Muslims were on the right path, but they, for their own materialistic reasons, chose not to accept the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So when you understand all of that, I think it helps you to contextualize everything, right? Put everything into perspective. Yeah. Now, I think we have to be careful, like depending on the age of children. You don't want to traumatize and depress them to such an like you want them to be aware of the Ummah and care about it. Yeah. But I've heard I've seen, like my daughter, for example, has had quite a difficult reaction. Like I think she's talking about things in a very philosophical way, that in quite I wouldn't say despairing way, but sure. Sadness. It could get to that level, it could get to that level for some people. So for example, I don't like this world. She literally said that to me. I don't like this world. There's just maybe from seeing one or two pictures or something that she must have come across, the idea that children would suffer and the world would, basically green light it. Right. I think it's very hard for our children to kind of come to terms with. So I think we really need to help them to see through this. And the way to do that is, I think, partly through those stories, like I said, through them understanding the nature of good versus evil, the nature of believers and their role throughout history. If you think about Waraqah bin Nawfal, the way he reacted when the Prophet ﷺ, when he realized he was a prophet, he said, I wish I was a young man so that I could fight with you when your people throw you out. And the Prophet ﷺ said, are they going to throw me out? He couldn't imagine that. He was like a celebrity almost, right? Him and Khadija, they were like the celebrity couple of Mecca. They're going to throw us out. And Waraqah said, yeah, anyone who come with a message like yours has always been treated like that, right? Now, Waraqah knew that because he knew the stories of the prophets. Yeah. So if our children, if we can acquaint them with the stories of victory, but also the stories of challenge that the Prophet ﷺ and others went through, other prophets, David and Goliath, all of these stories, Musa alayhi salam and Fir'aun, right? That Allah can split the sea for you. He can. That Allah tests believers, and yes, it can get to the point where it feels like, when will the help of Allah come, right? Yeah. I think that realism is important for our kids if we want to strengthen them. We can't bring them up without realizing that, the forces of evil can get really nasty. Yeah. But your job is to stand your ground. And look at the brothers and sisters in Palestine. They're inspiring non-Muslims to look into Islam. I've seen TikTok videos of non-Muslims who are like, I can't believe that these people have got this faith. I'm actually going to read the Quran. They want to read the Quran because they've seen their faith. It's like the, Ashab al-Ukhdud. That's another story,
I've had educators, because I'm constantly reaching out to educators here. My stuff. I've had I've had more than one educator reach out to me asking about getting a translation of the Quran since this happened, because of that. I think the stories of the prophets, peace be upon all of them. I've noticed sometimes kids, the stories of the prophets help you understand how you relate to the non-Muslims in general, which is essentially that it's a lifelong mission to call them to Islam. And sometimes the inferiority complex and the stigma of being an immigrant, I think, can condition that idea out of people, and it doesn't always resonate with the kids when they are young. And of course, kids need to learn wisdom to do that, and you don't want them to be overly aggressive. You don't want them to put themselves in a situation that might be safe in this type of thing. But I think conceptually they have to understand that.
Yeah.
And, especially kids, if they don't understand the Arabic and they learn to memorize the Quran without actually knowing the stories of it, sometimes that can take place. And I disagree 100% that it's a huge remedy to this.
And at the same time, to encourage them not to be fearful, to stand firm, to be willing to be Muslims, visible Muslims, carry on with their work, and not allow the political class, the media, etc., to make you into a coward, basically. I think the way they see us react as parents, they're probably, I thought it was very important for my family anyway, for me to take them to one of the protests, personally, I know that people have different views on that, but I know that, especially in the West, in the Western context, okay, I'm not talking about people in the East, they have their own ulama that can advise them, right? But people in the West, one of the means that we do have is to go out onto the streets to make a statement, to make a statement to the political class that we see you and the crimes that you're doing, we're not blind to them, and you don't represent us, and we feel very strongly about this. Today was one of the biggest protests in London, actually, and this has been the third week.
Awesome images.
First week there were about 30,000. Second week there were about.
I saw some estimates on Twitter that were saying 500,000 today.
Yeah, especially after last night. Yeah, we're a complete blackout in Gaza, and so personally, I got my sons together this morning. I showed them a message from one of the brave brothers in Gaza before the blackout happened. His message to Muslims, because I also want them to realize the privilege they have, the privileged position that they're in, and how we have brothers, we have people who are mujahideen, who are, struggling and fighting in the way of Allah, even in our times. And for them not to be naive about that, but at the same time, the message of the brother from Gaza was, make dua for us. He said, if you can't do anything more than that, if you're not some kind of, you don't have any clout, for example, the very least, and he said, and it's not a little thing, is raise your hands up and make dua for us, because dua is the weapon of the believer. And then he said, and spread the information about what's happening here to the four corners of the earth, so that people know that it's not kept hidden. And then the third thing he said was, and come onto the streets and to make a statement to your governments, to the people, that you're aware of what's going on, and you don't agree with it. So my sons are seeing that. I think, I just said to them, let's make dua right now. They have to stay connected with the Ummah. And I think, so in other words, we're not completely hiding it away from them. You can't anyway when they're a certain age. They're seeing it themselves.
Right.
At the same time, you're encouraging them not to do anything stupid, right? Because out of emotion, a young person could say something or express themselves in such a way that is not wise, So you want to help them navigate that, but at the same time not to be cowardly, because I think at this time there's a pressure being put on us all to not even say anything.
Correct, right.
You know?
And I think there's a few things. I like letting people know it's important for young kids to understand actually how knowledge about the whole situation has changed over time, actually. Because even 20 years ago, really even 10 years ago, people in general, I mean, the non-Muslims, they were not as informed about the situation as they are now. And there's been these surveys showing how by the generation, more and more people support the Palestinians in it. And, the baby boom generation, they're kind of the last generation to just get everything from the basic news stations.
Mainstream media,
So they're still very powerful because they have the wealth in all these societies, but they're limited for specific reasons. And people who have had access to more information, they know more. And Muslims have played a big role in that type of effort. I mean, like I said, I was 17 when 9/11 happened. And, being an Arab kid at that time, my father's family, he actually has a faction of the family that is his Arab side was very like a Republican and pro-America and forget being Arab, that type of thing. And then he had one aunt who was like really pro-Palestinian activist. So I can remember at that time that great aunt of mine being my only reference I had to there being an alternative opinion to Israel being the ally of the United States and Israel being a good thing. Like at that time, she was the only thing I had about that. Then of course I looked into it more and found out about it. So, it's really not that way right now. The opportunity to educate people is really there. I want to say one specific thing. Sorry, this is sort of a little specific to my follow because I have a fair amount of followers in Minnesota here.
Yeah.
I don't recommend people to go to protests here in Minnesota specifically, just because we have a faction of anarchists in our city who try to use these things to deliberately create rioting, which really broke out in 2020 with the George Floyd riots. That didn't just happen randomly. That's based on some specific crazy people that we have here in this city who try to do that with protests. So I just say to Muslims in Minnesota, I don't recommend going to protests here, which is kind of a side thing, but I wanted to throw that out there.
I think every community refer to your scholars and and the people who know in your area, because it's a specific thing. In London, remember, London is an iconic city.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. I think there's power.
And also London, sadly, is one of the centers from which Israel gets its support, And so for Londoners to make a statement is very important, I think. And it's been very peaceful, alhamdulillah. There's a lot of different groups involved, and anyway, the point is that there's different means, right? There's letters that can be written to MPs. There's whatever efforts or influences that you can have. There's educating of your local community that can take place. I think also with our kids as they get older, to actually give them an insight into the history of the place, the importance of Masjid al-Aqsa. Remember, we don't want to ever allow the importance of Masjid al-Aqsa to be removed from the future generations' hearts, because I think that's one of the things that Zionists rely on, on the future generations of Muslims not caring, the future generations of Palestinians not caring as much. Inshallah, that hasn't happened yet, but I think, it takes effort and time to just sit down with your kids and actually go through the history with them. Tell them about Masjid al-Aqsa. Tell them about, what's going on there and what has been going on. And yes, they will feel a sense of, how could this injustice happen? Right. But I think it's one element of the longer, legacy and history of colonialism, really. Maybe one of the last vestiges of that.
Very much so.
So if we introduce them to that, they understand what happened in our own parents' countries. I think it helps them to contextualize it.
So one thing, something I'm curious your thoughts on. Something I've seen young people, actually Muslims in general in the West, but young people struggle with a lot. Is the general mode of polite society, certainly in America, I think it's the same in the UK, maybe even more so in Europe, is you don't talk about religion frequently in everyday conversation with people. So, you get by without religion being present. And then as a Muslim, Islam is very important to you, and being Muslim, all this type of thing, but you're not generally talking about with people. So when being a Muslim comes up is within the context of some type of conflict, which sometimes that might be something interpersonal, like they invite you to a Christmas party or something like that. But a lot of times it's these grander geopolitical things that they want to know your opinion on about this type of thing. What advice do you like? What advice do you give people or young people if they're confronted with something like that? Someone asks them, like, what do you think of Hamas or this type of thing?
What do you think of Hamas? Right. So
did
I think everyone.
I'm not sure if you cut out there.
Sorry?
Did you hear everything I said? I'm not sure if you cut out for a little bit.
Yeah. I heard it. Well, yeah.
Okay.
So I think I don't know if they, from what I've seen, schools are especially universities, are kind of avoiding it completely. Like,
right.
I'm not seeing my sons come home and saying,
But it might not even be like a teacher. It could be just someone they know.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. So this is where educating people comes in, right? So I think some of the analogies that have been used are very good. Things like, well, look, if somebody broke into your house, took it over, threw you into your, basement, and then took over your house and was living there, and then you decided to fight back and break out of that basement,
right? And
would you be in the wrong for resisting? Right. So we don't even need to talk about, because, in some countries like Britain, certain groups are proscribed, right? They're banned. You can't even express support for any particular group, right? So that's why.
Interesting.
And we don't even need to mention names. We can say resistance, like the idea of resisting oppression,
right?
Is that a bad thing?
Mm-hmm.
No, that's not a bad thing. We can educate people if they have some doubt about, what the Islamic rules of engagement are regarding war. If we feel that they need to know that. But I think overall, the whole kind of history of colonialism, the taking over of land, the the fact that the UN, and international law, right, is something, confirms that Israel is an apartheid state, that the Palestinians, not only was their land taken at that time, back in the time of the Nakba, but then beyond that, every single year, every so often, their land is encroached upon, settlements built, people thrown out of their homes, right. The siege of Gaza, the fact that, only the amount of calories that will just keep them out of abject poverty and hunger are allowed into that space, right? I think we need to educate people about all of that and say, that's what we want to focus on, right? And that people who are oppressed have a right to resist.
Absolutely. I think that kind of being cornered into having to talk about a conflict or talk about Islam or talk about being Muslim in the context of a conflict, I think that is something that the individuals and the community really suffered from in the post 9/11 era. And especially for people who are more emotionally fragile, whether we're talking about children or young females. It can, compromising can really feel tempting in those types of situations, because you don't want friction with people. You don't want people to think bad about you. So I think that is where, and the phrase is like Islam is a religion of peace and this type of thing. That was actually developed by non-Muslims and kind of given to us as something to say. And that got so bad that I used to ask kids in my school, what the word Islam meant, and they would say peace. They would say it meant the word peace. Like the whole class thought that, a class of all Muslim kids, this type of thing. So, I advise people in general, and certainly kids too, that if someone brings up something that is contextualized by a conflict with you, you can always say that you don't want to talk about the conflict, but invite them to read something. Tell them that you are happy to connect them to some reading material. If it's something specific about what Islam says about XYZ, tell them that really, you prefer people to learn about Islam from A to Z from the beginning before talking about something specific. You can offer them a book. If it's about the conflict,
but also don't accept every accusation against our Muslims, right? Like Muslim brothers, Muslim communities, wherever they are, right? Because we don't even know really, some of the news reports. We don't even know if they're true, right? We know that these entities lie all the time, and that they're trying to manufacture consent from their own people, right? At the moment for war. So, we can't even trust the information that comes out about what has happened and what is happening. And, so I think we want to also encourage people to not be so gullible as to believe everything that they hear.
Very true.
Right? Nelson Mandela was a terrorist in Britain, right? Margaret Thatcher called him a terrorist. And now he's like, there's a statue of Nelson Mandela outside the House of Parliament, right? Wow. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, if we give some of those examples that, I think this is why the Irish completely understand this whole thing, right? Because they've been through that whole process, right? They've been colonized, and they were colonized for so long, and they had a long fight to fight. And they were, subhanAllah, I was watching this documentary about how the Irish, propaganda was created against them. And literally, in those days, it was like drawings, right? This is like going way back before, because that's a very old conflict. They literally drew pictures, and obviously in those times it was like the printing press and hand-drawn pictures of people beheading babies, attacking babies, and all. Like, it's as if, subhanAllah, the same playbook, and they were demonizing them so that they could manufacture consent at that time for war with the Irish.
Wow.
And it's only up until recently that the Irish were not treated like second-class citizens here in UK.
Wow.
No blacks, no Irish, they used to say on the shops, and the Irish are white, right? Like, so it had nothing to do with the race even in that sense. So I think that's why the Irish really understand the struggle. But yeah, I think we need to also find allies. There are people who are much more aware now as well. But also inform and educate people. I don't think there's anything controversial in that.
Correct.
With hikmah. Yep. But also, I think we want to get away from short-termism. So when it's very easy to get kind of so embroiled in this that, like, for example, I've got some exams that I'm supposed to be sitting like in the next few days. I'm so distracted, to be perfectly honest, and we should be like, we should care, and we should be doing what we can. At the same time, we've got to tell our kids and remind ourselves that we're playing the long game here, like the hard work that you do every day, you're building yourself up to become somebody who is a leader, who's a contributor, who could have some impact and some influence. And I think that's another thing that has changed. Have you noticed? I don't know if you've noticed this, but in the UK, definitely, we've got so many more articulate speakers, so many more. I mean, like, from just average Muslims, who can speak up, who are very well educated, articulate, well versed in history, well versed in the Western culture, understand Western culture. So that has happened over a whole generation, right?
Well, and I think actually an important thing to press about that point specifically with young people is a lot of those people, and myself included. Even the education I'm doing to people now, it's something that I envisioned 15, 16 years ago.
Right.
And I was motivated by the context of the war and terror, and knowing information that was being put out there so little. So in a way, there is a story of accomplishment to tell the kids that the community that we have accomplished to a degree, because all the short termism that you're talking about and that emotional experience, everyone went through it after 9/11 and the other things that happened after that. We all went through that. But here we are 20 years later. There's more Muslims. There's more people who've come to Islam.
Yep.
There's more people to educate. So the long-term work has actually played out in our favor.
Yes.
So this is part of their story, and
the whole idea of wal aqibatu lil muttaqin, we have to inculcate that in our kids, make them realize that it's a long game. It's the long game, the long-term thing that we have to look at, because over the long term things change, right? Things can completely flip around, completely. And that comes with hard work, and like you said, continuous work, daily work. So when your child, like your adult son or daughter, are going to university or doing some work or even getting married, having children, when they come to that, all of this is important. All of this is important. Like, we are one of the communities that has the highest birth rate, right? And that's a great thing. That's something we should be proud of. That means, what that actually means is that we value motherhood more than any other community, right? That means that we actually value parenthood. We value family, the next generation. We understand the importance of legacy, of community, We don't want to lose that. So I think part of playing the long game is making sure our children, our daughters, for example, understand the importance of motherhood, value that, and that we're not pushing them into, only having a careerist kind of mindset, right? Part of that is that our sons think long term. It's so easy to think short term. Long term takes effort, takes time. There were times when the Prophet ﷺ seemed to be on the back foot, right? Things seemed to be on the back foot for the Muslims. Treaty of Hudaybiyah, but they ended up being things that caused the ultimate victory, right? So as Muslims, we have to be strategic. We have to think long term. When we were younger, it was actually the Salman Rushdie affair that was the biggest thing that our parents' generation were dealing with in the media.
Right.
And when you just watch documentaries of that period, you think, subhanAllah, poor uncles, they just literally had just learned English, sort of thing, right? And they were having to be spokespeople for Muslims, and in a way they didn't really know how to respond, and they were being talked about in such a negative way. This is before 9/11, right? So it had already started, that kind of negative media about Muslims being like the fifth column, all of that. And they had to deal with that with the very limited resources they had, sometimes language barrier, all of that. When you can contrast that to our times, I think we can see that there has been a big change in that regard.
What you said about motherhood, I'm not exactly sure how to articulate my thought on this, but there's, especially because I have 3 daughters, but there's specific things pertaining to motherhood about this whole affair, and what we teach to the daughters that have wrapped my mind a little bit. Number one, I mean, you mentioned your own daughter being very, very upset about the loss of, the Palestinian children. I mean, all this imagery of the children being hurt, I think, can hit females in a very harrowing way. Is that something that can be, I don't want to use the word leveraged, but have them understand, okay, there are people who want to kill Muslim children. It's just a fact. So therefore, being a Muslim mother is an empowering thing, and it is actually an act itself against the evil forces that exist in the world. I'm curious of what you think of that type of framing of talk. We'll go with that. Then, if we have time, inshallah, I'll ask the next thing.
I think I would avoid connecting the two too much for a very young. It depends on the child's personality, but I feel like sometimes the way motherhood is presented is a little bit scary already, right? For young people, and so if you keep, we want things to have positive connotation, right? But yeah, as they get older, or even in a different context, you can make them understand this idea, right? That look, one of the reasons I wanted to have children and have lots of children, children are a blessing from Allah. When you have children, they are the worshippers of Allah on the earth. You're increasing the numbers of worshippers of Allah on the earth, of people who are able to do good. So, counter that whole kind of climate change angry narrative of like, there's too many people in the world and, people are having too many kids, all of that, put that to the side and say, no, we need more good people in the world, right? And if the believers have more children, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has encouraged us to do that, to have more children, but also I think help them to nurture their feminine, natural maternal instinct, so maybe they're exposed to other children in the family, babies, get them, not to continuously talk to them about careers and, being very kind of money driven or other types of things, that we might subtly inculcate in them just because the wider society is doing that.
Sure.
It's fine for them to be a mother. It's fine for them to, being educated is not just about having a career anyway. Having an education can help you be a good mother, right? Because we need intelligent mothers. Hopefully intelligent mothers will raise intelligent children, So sometimes parents put into their child the idea that as if education is a waste if they don't turn it into a career, right?
Right.
And even our boys sometimes have picked that up, right? Because of the whole kind of culture online, of like being against the 9 to 5 and all of that, right?
Right. Yeah, it's true.
A lot of teenage boys, as they go, they're like, "What's the point of university?" Right. There is a whole narrative out there for older boys.
Oh, I know.
And
they're all going to start businesses and make money by sitting on the couch when they're 20.
And that's fine, that you don't want to quash that dream. And I do think we want entrepreneurs. We want to increase that.
Some of them, I mean, it depends. Some of them have an entrepreneurial drive. And actually, a lot of Muslim cultures encourage that already, too. So it's an offshoot of that. There is some of them, though, who the idea of they want to own a business is they think that it's going to be something that will make them money without them having to work.
Yeah.
It's of course not that at all. So
the way I dealt with that with one of my sons was, fine, you still have to go to university, right? Because university isn't about work. For us, university isn't about work. It's about learning a certain ethic. It's about learning how to think, how to organize yourself. Do you know what I mean? To be honest, it's actually about all of that for me rather than a profession necessarily, right? In the UK, we have apprenticeships as well. We have different things, apart from university. But, I'm just sharing how I dealt with that with one of my sons who's that way inclined, that sure, do your business or whatever you want to set up. We will help you with that. But at the same time, you're going to go to university because university isn't just about making money. It's not about that. In fact, it's going to help you to be an articulate human being. There's many other things that I feel university can give, especially a young man.
Yep.
And I can see it. I can see the discipline, even just that whole experience of having being involved in the Islamic society. I think it's a rite of passage, actually.
Since it came up, I'll share, working in a high school, we do a lot of connecting kids to careers and this type of stuff and connecting to local businesses. We have a lot of big companies here in Minnesota and this type of thing. And a lot of times we're told by companies when it comes to hiring people, even though they have positions where they don't necessarily a license or a degree is not necessarily a requirement for it.
Exactly.
They still prefer to hire people with a degree, just
Yeah.
because they find in general that people who have completed a degree, their level of responsibility and maturity and with the way that they conduct
Yeah.
themselves in the job just tends to be a higher level. So
Yeah.
they experience that as a security blanket.
Yeah, I think the one thing that might be different with our generation that should be is not to be too dictatorial about what what they actually study, you know.
Yes, I agree with
So
that.
like we do need artists, we do need you know, social people who have social studies backgrounds, history backgrounds, policy studies, law, you know, we need all of that. It's not just doctors,
And
engineers, and
my impression is controlling the academic field of choice has been a bit of an issue in South Asian culture.
yeah, alhamdulillah, in my family it wasn't like that. 'Cause my dad, my brother did art, which was very, he's an art director, and he's a, you know, very successful designer, mashallah. But you know, that wasn't the norm, you know, for Asians to. So I think that's another aspect of my parents' upbringing, you know, being a bit hands off when it comes to big decisions about your life and, you know, what
I
you're
mean,
going to do.
that too, being trapped into a profession that someone dislikes, that can be a very big emotional burden on a person, and because your work consumes so much of your life.
Mm,
And for Muslim parents, you know, like you said, there is things that are non-negotiable, and there are certain boundaries that we want to keep the kids within and not go outside of. So don't make things tighter than they have to be,
right.
because the profession.
Even in the choice of marriage, for example, right?
Hmm.
Um, Parents get a bit control freak out, you know, when it comes to marriage choice, and or at least the previous generation were, and what they think their son or daughter, especially son, should be doing in terms of profession. But you know, I think every human being needs a bit of autonomy, and don't I want my children to be happy and successful, fulfilled, you know. I hate seeing any young man or any person doing something that they feel they have to do, and they don't actually feel motivated to do, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
um of course that doesn't mean that you're going to enjoy every moment of something,
Right.
right? But as your competence increases, your confidence and your uh, capability increases, your enjoyment can increase as well. So yeah, I think we want people who are motivated, who are the best at what they choose to do, rather than who feel that they've been forced to do something just because it has some kind of status in their parents' eyes.
Completely. You know, you said something that I want to probe further on, because you said about how motherhood can seem kind of scary. I think being a male, I think that's something I need insight on. I'm curious for you to say more about that, and to try to give us men what's behind that statement exactly. So for a young, I mean, because to me, I feel like I notice motherly instincts in young females uh, a lot, and the reason I brought that, like we were talking about the image of seeing Palestinian children hurt, and you know, I mean that affects anybody, but you know, it might touch the core of a female even harder because of motherly instincts or this type of thing. So just tell me more about that. Like what does someone like me need to understand about that? Like why does motherhood look scary to a young female?
Well, first of all, I think in wider society, it's not celebrated. You know, it's when at school, like you said, one of the kind of conditioning is that, you know, when any conversation comes up about what do you want to be when you grow up and that kind of thing, motherhood is not even mentioned in our cultures when we introduce ourselves, right? So if I'm being introduced at a conference or you'll mention my degrees and my this and that, and you know, but hardly ever will the fact that I'm a married mother of four be mentioned. You know, that won't ever. So I think in Western cultures, people have just kept motherhood as this kind of secret thing that they do on the side. You know, it's mentioned in that way,
Right.
rather than being front and center of as something that should be valued and celebrated in a woman, right? And in people. So I think that has made it just not seem like an attractive option, right? Part of it could also be that our generation of mothers are a bit more, you know, outward looking maybe than our parents' generation were. You know, mothers who were more at home, more content with being at home as well and raising a family. Maybe that role modeling hasn't happened as well, you know. But that's because we were also conditioned, right? Like we were literally conditioned from a young age to be very outward looking and not looking within the home so much. But then I think also just sometimes the mechanics of having a baby, you know, like the biological side of it, when children become aware of that through school or through biology and whatever, that can sometimes be a bit scary for girls, you know, and then they, as they get older, they realize, okay, I'm going to have these monthly cycles and, you know, all of that. Unfortunately, it can seem like a bit of a burden to girls. So I think it's important to kind of frame it right, to celebrate being a female, you know, like, and allow them to enjoy it, you know. And again, we have to have our own conditioning that we're putting in place, which is showing them the beauty of parenthood, of motherhood, of raising children, being around children, being used to being around little children, maybe even looking after them themselves. All of that, I think, contributes to that. But also, like, when they're going to school, what are we putting in their minds as the end game? You know, is it that we're just constantly just driving them towards work? Is that because, remember, one of the negative effects of that did happen for one generation has been that girls were delaying marriage, right? Or marriage was being delayed to such an extent that we have a lot of young ladies, or actually not so young ladies now, who didn't get married and have kind of lost hope in getting married. That is a reality, you know, because I think there is sort of like a window. If you think of like religious young men, they're going to want to get married quite soon, you know, as soon as they're able to. And that tends to be in their 20s, either early 20s or mid 20s, you know. The practicing religious brothers, usually they're married by then. Why? Because they're chaste, you know, they're trying to keep chaste, and they're not having relationships like other men are, right? So for them, marriage is the outlet, or, you know, the way to go forward. Now, if they're getting married at that young age, and the girls are delaying marriage, and I think what happens is there comes to a point where the religious men are all married, and the religious girls, you know, they're getting older and they're not finding religious men. They're finding men, but not particularly practicing men, right? So that's a reality. And so I think we don't want to be encouraging our daughters to delay marriage more than is necessary. At the same time, not to go on about it, you know. I'm just saying that it's all part of preparing them, I think, mentally for the real world.
Yeah. Well, when you were talking about celebrating motherhood, I was trying to think, because I think I mentioned earlier, I have plenty of younger adult men who follow me and they ask about this question, maybe pertaining to their sisters, their cousins, or whoever, their female cousins. You know, I'm trying to think, well, what can they do to help them celebrate motherhood? Because they can't change the general standards of society. But it does occur to me that, you know, for young brothers, treating their own mothers very well is probably has a place in affecting their sisters' impression of motherhood. because if you are, a misbehaved, rowdy adolescent yourself, or someone who gives your mother a bunch of fear and worry and anxiety and difficulty, what impression is that going to give your sister of what motherhood means? So,
and also I think with brothers, encouraging them to think of sisters as part of their responsibility, like in a positive way. So when they get to a certain age, you say to them, pay for things for your sister, right?
Yeah.
Start getting them to take responsibility, because I think another problem that is happening is a lot of young men who are getting married are now expecting their wives to work and contribute financially, right? And then that then causes the couple, I think it can cause strain as well, and it can also go on to cause delay in having children and all of that, right? And a dependence on the wife's earnings. Now that might be fine, like if some families that might have worked that out, fine, but we don't want that to become the norm, where young men go into marriage expecting their wives to financially contribute, because I think that upsets the balance. And I think that's part of it, is because there's a generation of young men being brought up not having that sense of responsibility, that actually, my sister shouldn't have to pay for anything, I'm gonna take care of her. So that kind of feeling of taking care of women, I think has to be inculcated from a young age.
Yeah, and I think especially inculcated in a way that is positive and proactive, because I think a lot of young men, they tend to just look at perhaps things in their sister or cousin that they see as negative, and then want to turn that around or change that or focus on that. And that type of approach can just have compounding negative effects, I think.
But then on the flip side, you also say to the girls, hey, it's fine for you to iron your brother's clothes. It's fine for you to do things for your brother. He can do things for you, and you can do things for him. It doesn't have to be exactly those things, but do you know what I mean? Like,
I do know what you mean, and I certainly support encouraging a sense of the gender roles taking hold in the different ways that sons and daughters might be raised. Something that I'm confronted with in talking to educators, public school educators, and Muslim kids a lot. And it's actually, I have it cited in my book. It's actually backed up by case studies that have done of Muslim kids in public schools, including South Asians in the UK. It's a common impression of teachers to have the impression of Muslim boys that they are irresponsible and things like they don't always clean up after themselves and all this type of stuff. And sometimes it has been attributed to the idea that they don't have enough domestic duties at home. Now, I personally think that boys should partake in chores and domestic duties at home. Why? Because, the domestic role, it's an adult role, and it's the traditionally female role. So the adult role or the traditional female role, it's accessible for young people to do still at a young age. But as societies have developed, and the adult role for the male, it is as the breadwinner, it is much less based on physical labor now in the modern times. It's based on intellectual work. So whereas in times a few generations ago, you could have had an 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old helping out in the fields to sow the crops or taking the animals out in the grazing missions or whatever. But he can't go to the office and help, dad do whatever, run whatever papers he's got to run or whatever when he's that age. So this is where adolescence comes from. So sometimes I feel like it's the case that Muslim boys are maybe being raised in a way where their development of responsibility is dematured compared to other kids sometimes, because they've had other people only doing the domestic roles sometimes, and that they need to do at least a modicum of that, just so they can be along the maturation of responsibility on the appropriate continuum.
Yeah, definitely. I think everyone should have chores in the house. Everyone has their roles and their jobs. With that thing, I was just highlighting that that idea of cooperation, that not to be like, well, why should I do something for him? That attitude that a lot of young girls now have, why should I do something for him? That's going to translate later into marriage perhaps as well, so we don't want that, because sometimes it's not visible to the girls what the boys are doing.
Sure.
Or to the wife what the husband is doing, for example. And so just to prepare for that mindset, of like, no, it's fine if I help. Okay, you're not going to Jummah, for example, but if you help your brother to get to Jummah with nicely ironed clothes, right, you'll get reward for that. That mindset of women doing things for men and men doing things for women to support their roles and is actually going to be beneficial for both of you. Something rewardable for both of you. I think that to get away from that individualism, I think.
I wanted to say what you were saying before about going to school, and they ask you about what career you want to do, and it's like girls, they don't think to mention being a mother, being a wife, or any of that type of thing. I have that's a writing prompt that is probably given to kids every single year in their language arts and their English classes. And I've been in a lot of those classrooms co-teaching with another teacher who gave kids that reading prompt. So I see it all the time with most kids. I'd say like sometimes they almost like don't even think that that's something that they could put,
right,
or be appropriate to put. However, almost once a year, like there with the kids I teach, there is usually some girl, and it's actually some girls, and it's actually increasing. It had to happen this year. There was a girl who the teacher said, okay, you're going to write about what you want to be in 10 years. And a girl just said out loud, oh, I'm going to be a housewife. She said that right out loud. And I've seen it happen a few times. And the non-Muslim teachers' impulsive response, their impulsive response is always, oh, you can be more than that. They always, it's like it's conditioned in them. That is always how they respond. They say,
exactly,
you can be more than that. So this is something for parents actually to talk with kids about. And this is something too, parents have to have kind of a feel for the things kids are going to be confronted with in school, down to the level of like specific assignments and writing prompts they're going to get, and let them know, it's okay to answer this. It's okay to say that, this type of thing.
But also the way we talk to each other, right? Like in the way we value one another. And, I think we've started as well as a Muslim community to say things like, oh, mashallah, sister so-and-so, she's done X, Y, Z. And we'll always mention outside the home stuff, So we've also picked up that. And what that does is it then just conveys the idea that those are the things to value, right? Like when actually motherhood is hard, meaning it takes a lot of effort and time. And so when we diminish it like that, we actually lie to our daughters. We're lying to the next generation of girls and boys, because boys also think, well, what does she do all day, right? Like, they can also start thinking that. And they don't realize the physical and the emotional and just the whole kind of effort that it takes to raise children well and, cook a homemade meal for the family. All of those things, they take time and effort. You can't outsource all of that, really. There's a core that you can't outsource. So we need to value those things just for our own community's self-preservation. Absolutely. And for the next generations, not to become, for the birth rate, basically, not to keep going down and down and down until it gets to the point where, as the wider society is suffering from, they have an aging population, facing population decline, etc. We don't want that. Inshallah, that won't happen, but I can see that some of our attitudes have changed, and maybe we're raising children to have unrealistic expectations of marriage, or unhealthy expectations. Yeah.
Jazakumullah khairan, sister. We've been going for 2.5 hours here. I really appreciate it. I think we could keep going, but life's got to go. Life's got to go on.
Yes, of course.
So look, why don't you share? People might know, but I think you're on most of the social media platforms. Share where we can find you, things you're doing that you want people to know about, please.
Yeah. So this coming week on Thursday, the 2nd of November at 7 p.m. London time, which is about 2 p.m. New York, I believe, we're having a free webinar. Inshallah, I'm going to be teaching a free webinar. It's called Alif to Ya and Beyond. And it's essentially my roadmap to teaching children Quran. So from the beginning to, reading the entire Quran, and then perhaps going on for hifth, or maybe alongside that doing hifth, what my methodology is to get to them to that stage, for them to love the Quran, for them to be motivated, but also just practically speaking, if you're starting out and you're like, I don't know how to get them to that stage, maybe you'd like to, have them read the whole Quran to a teacher and gain an ijaza, right? Which means that they've recited the Quran to somebody who's recited it to someone, all the way going back to the Prophet ﷺ and to the angel Jibreel, to Allah. That I really want to encourage parents to have higher kind of goals when it comes to Quran and their children, because I think sometimes people start off with high dreams and expectations, that it kind of fizzles out at a certain point. So I want to empower them with the knowledge to be able to do that confidently. So if you'd like to attend that webinar, you just have to go to raisingbelievers.com/Quran webinar, which is one word. So that's QURAN WEBINAR, Quran webinar. So it's raisingbelievers.com/Quran webinar. And you can just register, inshallah, join us. And if you can't attend live, we will be sending the recording to everyone anyway. So do register, inshallah, and I hope to see you then. We've also got another cohort of Raising Believers, the 6-week course. Part of the course, we actually have a mini course which we give everyone, which is called Raising a Hafidh, which goes through like a framework for if you want to raise a Hafidh, what kinds of things do you need to be aware of? What kinds of things might the journey entail? And again, my method for doing that. So yeah, you can look into the course. It's raisingbelievers.com, and our new cohort is going to be starting in November. The great thing about it is you get to be with a group of parents, like-minded parents, and go through the journey with them, and you have a chat group as well, where you can always, I think, that saying, it takes a village to raise a child. I think sometimes those villages can be online as well, if we can't always have them in reality, in person. So I'm hoping that we can create that, inshallah.
Jazakumullah khairan. I ask Allah to make this a benefit to people. May Allah reward you for your time and all the efforts that you're making for the Ummah. Anything good that came from this comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anything wrong that comes from it comes from the deficiencies within ourselves. I ask Allah, I bear witness that there's none worthy of worship but Allah alone, and we seek repentance from Him.
Thank you, brother. I must say, just lastly, that I found your insights as a teacher very interesting, mashallah. I think we need to bring more of those to people's attention, mashallah.
Inshallah. Well, I'm going to end the recording here.